It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. I had packed up my truck, brought a few supplies, and headed out to my lakefront cabin, my favorite escape from the noise of everyday life. The weather was perfect, the water calm, and I was ready to unwind. As I pulled up, I couldn't help but admire the dock I had built with my own two hands. It extended right off my property into the water, nestled into a quiet, private corner of the lake. That dock had seen bonfires, quiet mornings with coffee, and memories that I wouldn't trade for anything. But that day, something was different. I had barely finished unloading my gear when I noticed a familiar figure striding across the edge of the gravel road near my cabin. It was Karen. If you've ever lived in an HOA, you know exactly the kind of person I mean. Clipboard in hand, oversized sunglasses, a stiff walk like she's on patrol, always on the lookout for someone else to correct. I wasn't even surprised to see her, but I also wasn't expecting what came next. She didn't greet me, didn't ask any questions, didn't even pretend to be neighborly. She went straight into it, demanding to know what I thought I was doing using the community dock. I told her calmly that the dock was on my deeded land and had been part of my cabin lot for years. She ignored that completely, launching into some HOA regulation speech about permits, usage restrictions, and unauthorized structures. I tried to interject again, but she wasn't having it. According to her, if I didn't vacate the area immediately, she'd have no choice but to call the authorities. Now, I knew she didn't have a leg to stand on, but I was curious to see just how far she'd go. So I leaned back on the railing and let her do her thing. That's when she pulled out her phone. I heard her voice clearly as she told 911 there was a trespasser on the dock and that the individual, me, was refusing to leave HOA-controlled property. I could hardly believe it. She was actually calling the cops. On me. On my dock. At my cabin. The level of entitlement was something out of a movie. I watched her pace back and forth like a mall security guard on high alert, throwing glances at me while keeping her distance. She was clearly expecting me to panic, maybe even flee the scene before law enforcement arrived. What she didn't know was that not only was I completely within my rights to be there, but I also had every piece of documentation proving that dock was privately owned and not under any HOA jurisdiction. As she waited for the police, I sat calmly in my Adirondack chair, sipping a soda and scrolling through my emails. I had no reason to worry, but I could feel the tension radiating off her. She kept muttering into her phone, probably talking to another board member or trying to dig up some obscure HOA clause she thought might save her from the embarrassment that was about to unfold. A few cars drove by slowly, and I could tell word was already spreading. People around here love to gossip, especially when Karen's involved. It's not every day she calls the cops and stands guard on a supposedly hostile dock. By the time the sheriff's vehicle pulled into the gravel turnoff, a couple of neighbors had parked nearby to watch. One even brought popcorn. Karen rushed toward the officer like she'd been waiting to file a formal report, arms flailing, voice raised, and entirely convinced she was doing the neighborhood a great service. I greeted the deputy with a smile, stood up, and calmly handed him a folder I kept in the cabin just in case something like this ever happened. Property deeds, survey maps, zoning permissions, all of it right there in black and white. As he skimmed the papers, his expression shifted from neutral to mildly amused. He turned to Karen, asked a few clarifying questions, and then gave her a look that said it all. She started to protest, but he held up his hand, told her to step back, and walked over to shake my hand. Karen froze. It was only the beginning of what would unravel later that day, but in that moment, watching Karen realize the cops weren't there to escort me away, but to explain to her that she had no authority here, that was something I won't forget. After the officer left and the spectacle had simmered down, you'd think the situation would be over. But Karen? Oh no, that woman operates on a different level of delusion. Having been politely but firmly shut down by law enforcement didn't stop her. It just made her dig in even deeper. Within an hour, she was back in full force, this time with a clipboard, a fresh stack of HOA violation forms, and what looked like a printed copy of the HOA rule she'd highlighted herself. She stormed down the path toward the lake like she had just been appointed neighborhood commander by the governor. She stood at the edge of my property and began lecturing me again, this time louder and with even more attitude. She declared that the dock, my grill setup, even the placement of my trash bins were not in compliance with HOA standards. I asked her again if she'd like to see the property lines, and I offered to bring out the county maps and survey reports. She refused to look at them, brushing off my legal paperwork as irrelevant to community regulations. According to her, the HOA had the right to enforce aesthetic and usage rules on anything that could be seen from public or shared spaces. That included, in her opinion, my dock and the entire lakefront, despite the fact that it sat fully on my deeded land. She wasn't just asserting control. She was convinced she had it. To her, everything that bordered HOA property fell under the HOA's invisible fence of authority. The idea that someone in the neighborhood might own something the HOA couldn't touch clearly rattled her. So she tried harder. She started taking pictures. My dock, my boat, my patio furniture. At one point, she even pointed her phone at my security cameras and accused me of surveillance intimidation, whatever that was supposed to mean. I watched this all unfold with a mix of disbelief and mild amusement. She really thought she could override legal ownership with rulebook quotes. But what made it worse was the way she strutted around with that false confidence. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was trying to reassert dominance after her embarrassing 911 stunt fell flat. In her mind, she couldn't lose twice. So she began escalating. By that afternoon, I had received a formal email from the HOA board listing multiple alleged violations: unapproved dock construction, non-permitted shoreline modification, excessive outdoor equipment, and inappropriate lake usage. The kicker? The email demanded I remove my dock within 30 days or face legal action. That dock has been on my property longer than her vinyl fence mini-mansion has even existed, and suddenly it was being treated like it had sprouted overnight without permission. But Karen wasn't done. She started canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors and warning residents that I was setting a dangerous precedent. According to her, if one homeowner could get away with ignoring HOA procedures, the entire community would spiral into chaos. She tried to rally people to submit complaints, spreading rumors that I had violated community trust. A few neighbors came by out of curiosity, asking if it was true that the HOA was coming after me. I showed them the documents. One guy laughed and said, "Typical Karen." She even tried to claim that the dock was built too far into the lake, violating view rights of other homeowners, a made-up concept that didn't exist in any rulebook. But that's how she worked. When actual rules didn't apply, she made up new ones and acted like they were universally accepted. What struck me most wasn't just her refusal to admit she was wrong. It was the way she tried to weaponize the HOA as a tool for her personal agenda. The organization meant to support the neighborhood had turned into her private army of clipboards and fine print. She believed that by sheer persistence, she could override facts, ownership, and even common sense. She was so used to people folding under pressure that it didn't occur to her that someone might push back, and push back legally. And the more she pressed, the more it exposed how flimsy her foundation really was. Neighbors who once feared her started distancing themselves. A few even told me they were tired of the way she ran the HOA like a dictatorship. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using them as a power play, trying to dictate how others lived on land she didn't own, under rules she didn't fully understand, with authority she definitely didn't have. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop letting Karen spin her narrative. She had already tried to get me kicked off my own dock, attempted to slap me with bogus HOA violations, and stirred up enough neighborhood gossip to fuel a small-town newsletter. What she hadn't done, though, was take the time to actually understand who she was dealing with. So I figured I'd give her a little education in property law and reality. I started by pulling out the official property deed for my cabin and dock. It clearly showed that the land extended not only to the water's edge, but several feet into the lake itself, granting me private rights to the dock area and shoreline. This wasn't some technicality or gray area. The boundaries had been established decades ago, long before the HOA was even formed. I had the original surveys, title reports, and a letter from the county confirming everything. My property was grandfathered in, immune to any HOA regulations because it existed independently and prior to their jurisdiction. I took the time to print out enlarged copies of the maps and records, highlighting the exact dimensions of my lot, including the portion that extended into the lake. I even added annotations explaining which permits were required at the county level and which fell outside HOA control. Karen kept accusing me of skipping approval processes, so I decided to show her that not only was I exempt, but I also had county-level authority backing every improvement I had made to the property. By mid-afternoon, she came marching back down the trail toward my dock again, clipboard in hand and a scowl that could curdle milk. This time, I met her at the edge of my gravel path and handed her the documents before she could say a word. She flipped through the first few pages and tried to keep her expression neutral, but I could see the cracks forming. The property map alone completely shut down her argument that the dock was on shared HOA land. Still, she tried. She muttered something about HOA rules applying to visible structures and communal aesthetics, but it was weak. I asked her point blank if she understood what it meant for a property to be legally separate from HOA governance. She didn't answer. I pointed to the date on the deed, the legal boundary line, the fact that her own HOA charter explicitly listed which lots were included under their control, and mine wasn't on that list. Not only did I own the dock, but the HOA had zero legal authority to interfere with anything on my land. But here's where it got even more interesting. Because of how the land around the lake had been divided over the years, my lot included the narrow strip of shoreline that bordered several other properties, which meant, technically, if anyone wanted to make changes that affected lake access, dredging, boat ramps, dock extensions, they had to go through the county. And the county? Well, they required written consent from the shoreline property owner. Me. Karen had spent the last year on the HOA board pushing new guidelines for lake usage, trying to control who could build what and where, and enforcing restrictions on the type of boats and equipment residents could store. All those initiatives required permits, and all those permits require my signature. She hadn't realized that in her crusade to dominate the lakefront, she was actually dependent on the person she had just called 911 on. I didn't even need to threaten anything. The documents spoke for themselves. She flipped through them again, slower this time, trying to grasp what it all meant. I could see it dawn on her. All that time and effort she'd spent barking orders and writing citations had been built on an illusion of control. The power she thought she had evaporated with every line of fine print she read. She handed the papers back without a word and turned around, walking away much quieter than usual. I didn't chase her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there, letting the weight of the truth settle in. From that day forward, everything changed. Not just with Karen, but with how the entire neighborhood saw the situation. Word got around fast. People began to ask questions about the HOA's actual authority and who really had jurisdiction over the lakefront. It was as if one confrontation had pulled back the curtain on years of assumed power, and the truth was finally catching up with the fiction. As the dust began to settle from the confrontation over my dock, the implications of the situation started to ripple out far beyond my cabin. The documents I had shown Karen weren't just about proving my own rights. They revealed a power structure she hadn't anticipated. What most people didn't realize was that the very permits the HOA needed to operate their lake-related activities had to pass through the county, and because of a unique quirk in land ownership along the lakefront, I held legal control over a stretch of shoreline that was crucial to those applications. That meant every time the HOA wanted to dredge the lake, approve new dock installations, or host community events near the water, they needed the written consent of whoever owned that shoreline. That owner was me. I had discovered this detail when I first purchased the cabin years ago. During the paperwork process, my real estate lawyer pointed it out as a formality, almost like a fun fact, just a technical advantage of how the lakefront had been parceled before the HOA was established. I never gave it much thought until Karen started throwing her clipboard weight around and trying to turn her position on the board into a full-time job of policing everyone else's lives. Once she crossed the line by calling 911 on me and attempting to slap violations onto my property, that fun fact suddenly became a strategic asset. The county permit system was clear. any activity that altered the shoreline, impacted erosion control zones, or added any structure into the lake required the adjacent property owner's signature. Over the years, the HOA had worked with the county to maintain lake access, build shared boat slips, even host summer events. But in every single one of those instances, they needed the approval of the shoreline owners to proceed. No signature, no permit. The power didn't lie with the HOA board. It lay with the individuals who actually owned the land, and it turned out I was one of the most critical among them. I hadn't exercised that authority before because I had no reason to. Things had been peaceful. But now, with Karen turning a personal grudge into a campaign of petty enforcement, I realized I needed to remind the HOA who really controlled the access points they so desperately relied on. I began reviewing past permits, checking signatures, and comparing them to county records. A few were legitimate. Some looked like they had been pushed through with assumptions, and one in particular lacked any shoreline approval at all. It was a floating platform Karen had personally championed during her first year on the board. That one caught my attention. Armed with this information, I paid a visit to the county office. I asked to speak with the clerk in charge of environmental zoning and presented my concerns. Not to be spiteful, but to understand exactly where the lines were drawn and how strictly the county enforced them. The clerk confirmed what I already knew. If the HOA wanted to continue any work on the lake, even basic maintenance, they needed updated consent from all adjacent landowners. I asked if there was a formal way to be notified when new permit applications were submitted, and they gladly added my name to the list. From that moment on, I would have visibility into every single move the HOA tried to make involving the lake. I didn't storm into the next HOA meeting. I didn't write a scathing letter. Instead, I simply let Karen and the rest of the board feel the consequences of their actions. The next time they submitted a permit for community kayak storage, the county flagged it for missing owner authorization. Karen was furious. She called, emailed, even sent a letter asking why I hadn't signed off on it. I replied once, very clearly, because no one asked. The silence that followed said everything. She realized too late that in her attempt to control the lake, she had alienated the person who controlled her access to it. Neighbors started to notice the delays. People who supported her began asking questions, wondering why everything was suddenly being held up. Slowly but surely, it became clear that her reign of unchecked enforcement wasn't backed by real authority. It had only lasted as long as no one had challenged her. Now the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just the guy she called 911 on anymore. I was the gatekeeper. Karen had always strutted around the neighborhood like she was untouchable. Whether it was barking orders at people for leaving their trash cans out too long or scribbling down notes on homeowners' lawn heights, she carried herself like the HOA was her personal empire. Even after the 911 call backfired and I had proven that the dock and shoreline were legally mine, she still clung to whatever illusion of authority she had left. But what she didn't realize was that her boldest move had just set the stage for her biggest embarrassment yet. And this time, the entire neighborhood would witness it. It started subtly. The usual smug confidence she wore like armor began to chip away. When she walked her usual morning loop around the block, clipboard in hand, her posture seemed just a little less upright. People didn't wave as eagerly as they once did. Some even looked away. Word travels fast in communities like ours, and Karen had unknowingly turned herself into the neighborhood punchline, calling 911 on someone peacefully sitting on their own dock. The kind of absurdity practically begged to be shared, and shared it was. The story spread like wildfire. It made its way into group texts, community Facebook posts, even casual conversation during lawn maintenance and mail runs. Everyone knew the basic facts, that Karen had called the police thinking she was enforcing HOA regulations, only to find out the person she reported not only owned the dock, but had the legal authority to approve or deny the HOA's lake permits. You couldn't write a more ironic script if you tried. And the best part? People began to realize how flimsy Karen's so-called authority really was. Up to that point, she had operated with fear as her greatest weapon. Homeowners went along with her citations and demands, not because they believed she was right, but because they didn't want to deal with the hassle. She weaponized confusion, using the vague language in HOA rulebooks to intimidate and control. But after the incident with my doc, people started asking more questions. They realized that if she could be so wrong, so publicly wrong, about something as simple as land ownership, what else was she bluffing about? At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was different. For the first time in years, people came not out of obligation, but curiosity. Karen sat at the head of the table with her usual binder of enforcement reports, but the energy had shifted. When she tried to open the meeting with an agenda point about shoreline decor standards, someone interrupted and asked if that was really under HOA jurisdiction. Another person chimed in about dock spacing regulations and whether they'd ever been legally approved. The questions kept coming, and Karen didn't have the answers. She tried to regain control by citing vague policy numbers, but no one was buying it anymore. The confidence she had leaned on for so long was gone, replaced by visible frustration. The very people who used to nod along with her were now scrutinizing every word. They had seen what happened when she overstepped, and they weren't willing to let her bulldoze through with the same tactics again. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, several homeowners contested their citations. One neighbor even filed a formal complaint about harassment, citing Karen's habit of stalking around the lake, taking unsolicited photos of people's backyards. Another requested a third-party audit of past HOA fines, suspecting that Karen had been interpreting the rules however she saw fit. It was like a dam had broken. People weren't afraid anymore because they saw her for what she really was, an overzealous volunteer with a title but no actual power. Karen, of course, tried to double down. She started sending out emails filled with warnings and policy reminders, hoping to reassert her grip on the community. But the responses weren't what they used to be. Instead of quiet compliance, she got pushback. Some replies questioned her authority outright. Others simply ignored her. The fear was gone, and so was the control she had built on top of it. Behind the scenes, several homeowners began talking about reforming the HOA board entirely. They wanted term limits, transparency, and clearer rules about what could and couldn't be enforced. Karen had sparked a movement, though not in the way she intended. What was supposed to be her moment of triumph, catching a supposed rule breaker in the act, had turned into the very event that exposed her overreach to the entire neighborhood. Her power trip hadn't just backfired, it had unraveled the illusion she had clung to for years. And the people she once intimidated were now seeing just how far she had drifted from what the HOA was actually supposed to be. The moment Karen called 911 on me in my own lake cabin, she thought she was issuing the final blow. She imagined it would be the defining moment where she demonstrated her control, where I'd be escorted off my own dock in front of the neighborhood, embarrassed and defeated. What she didn't count on was that her overreach would set off a chain of events that didn't just expose her lack of power. It changed the way the entire community viewed the HOA, its purpose, and its leadership. The 911 call wasn't the climax. It was the beginning of something bigger. After I calmly handed over my legal documents to the responding officer, something shifted, not just between Karen and me, but in the atmosphere of the community. The neighbors who had gathered, the ones who had peeked from porches or stopped during their evening walks, witnessed the entire exchange. They saw how calmly I stood my ground. They saw the moment the officer turned to Karen, not to back her up, but to correct her. That image stuck. For a community used to her pushing people around, it was the first time they saw her on the losing side of a confrontation she had started. Word spread quickly. I didn't have to say much. People started coming to me, asking questions, not just about what happened, but about their own properties, their own rights. Some of them had silently carried resentment about the way the HOA was run, about the letters they'd received for minor violations, or the endless citations for things like mailbox color and driveway cracks. Karen's call to 911 had forced them to realize how far things had gone. If she could call the police on someone sitting peacefully on his dock, what was stopping her from escalating other things? What were the limits? For years, the HOA had operated in a fog of assumed authority. Karen thrived in that fog. She used it to issue fines, enforce changes, and intimidate anyone who questioned her interpretations of the rules. But when that fog began to lift, thanks to the very public failure of her stunt, people started to see things clearly. They saw that authority isn't the same as power, and power without accountability is just bullying. They began asking for transparency. They began questioning whether the HOA was even acting within its own bylaws. I never had to organize anything formal. All I did was share what I knew. A few neighbors came by with their notices, and I looked them over. Some of the citations weren't even enforceable. Others had no basis in the governing documents. It was shocking to some of them. They had paid fines, made costly changes, or altered plans for their properties, all because they thought they had no choice. Now they saw that Karen had been relying more on their silence than on the rules. The pressure began mounting at HOA meetings. Attendance went up. People who had never shown up before were now coming with questions, asking for documentation, requesting itemized records of fees, and reviewing the minutes of past meetings. Karen, who had once ruled the room with her assertiveness and scripted agenda, started to lose her grip. The meetings got longer, more contentious. The board members, once silent in agreement, began to hesitate. They didn't want to go down with her. Karen tried to fight back. She accused me of turning the neighborhood against her. She claimed I was creating division. But it wasn't about me. It was about people finally feeling like they had a voice. Her tactics weren't working anymore. The fear was gone. The 911 call had opened their eyes to the absurdity of it all, and from that moment on, people refused to be passive. Eventually, proposals started rolling in for bylaw revisions. One neighbor drafted a measure for term limits on board members. Another called for third-party audits of HOA finances. Someone else pushed for mandatory training for anyone in an enforcement position. Every initiative had one goal: to prevent this kind of unchecked behavior from happening again. Neighbors began talking to each other more. They started helping each other review documents, coordinating responses to unfair citations, and reminding one another of their rights. The entire tone of the community shifted. It went from quiet compliance to active engagement. People were no longer just residents. They became participants in how their neighborhood was run. Karen, once the face of HOA authority, now found herself sidelined. Her credibility had crumbled under the weight of her own actions. She had tried to control everything with fear and rigid enforcement. But in trying to take down one man sitting on a dock, she ended up rallying the entire neighborhood. What she saw as a victory move had become a turning point for the community.